In this session, we thought we would do it as a panel and then an open discussion around the ethical issues that come up around exploring psychological flexibility, ACT or FT, in the scope and practice and work of BCBAs, and these scope and practice issues of how we're going to manage that immediately and in the future. So you want to go, Jonathan?
Sure. So I guess and I'm probably going to be beating a dead horse over the next 4 days, but it really comes back to function for me. And so to say something like, well, I'm not going to do ACT in my practice as a behavior analyst after this boot camp would be a little bit like saying, I'm not going to do reinforcement when I talk to a parent. I'm not going to consider. So in other words, once you understand behavior in terms of function, it's not really your choice. Like reinforcement and punishment and stimulus control is happening all the time for everyone, no matter what. Every time we interact with another verbally competent human, we are nudging them towards rigidity or flexibility. We are nudging them towards or away from values. We are nudging their rule-governed behavior to be more rigid or more flexible, whether we like it or not. Every time we tell a parent, well, you just have to do it because the research says so, we're nudging them towards rigid rule control and aversive control, right? Every time we say something like, every time we make a parent cry because we say something like, you know, what's really in it for you? Like what kind of future can we see for your child? We're nudging them towards values, and it's working, even though we didn't know we were doing it. Does that make sense? So, oops, it's like the Matrix. Once you take the pill, you can't unlearn what the Matrix is. That's where you all will be on Tuesday night. And so it's not a question of whether or not it's in your scope of practice. The only question is whether you're willing to actually give it a shot. But I'm not just saying then go do anything you want. I think like that plus don't do anything too crazy. Like what Steve just did with Tim, if you just went and did that Wednesday morning with a parent, like that exact thing, that might be a little bit irresponsible because it's so different from what you normally do already, I assume. Right? And it's such a large step. And maybe you're not quite as much of a verbal ninja yet as Steve is after 30 years of doing this, right? But it doesn't mean you're not doing ACT. It means you're going to pick something, and this is what we're going to do all day on Friday, is you're going to pick a few things and nudge them a little bit in the direction of the 6 processes. And so that's kind of my sort of, I guess, overall bigger picture thought on scope of practice.
Yeah, I don't have the BACB guidelines memorized, luckily. But
I'm going to report you for that.
My life, I mean, I can find them. But in there's a lot of things that I think match up with this ACT stuff. Utilizing instructional control strategies. I mean, isn't that what we've been playing with today? Teaching individuals to self-monitor. Utilizing derived stimulus relations. I mean, it's all in there. It's just a matter of you guys having, I think, the tools to take it from, the higher conceptual, kind of narrative we've been playing with today to like, what are you going to do when you get back to town? And I think that if you stay with a observable, measurable, dependent variable, that's a very comfy place to start. Changing thoughts and feelings is, I know that can feel a little bit funky for a behavior analyst, but there's things like, getting in line without screaming. There's, not running away when the fire drill starts. I mean, there are some very clear black and white, observable, measurable behaviors that we could use these instructional control strategies for and stay well within, I think at least, the scope of practice that we're supposed to have. Now that scope kind of differs depending on what state you're in. And if you're billing for this, or if you're just doing this, or, with a client for private pay. So I think that those external forces are going to, define some of these boundaries for you. And again, I think that we're really at the beginning of behavior analysts using this stuff. And so you guys are going to, whether fortunately or unfortunately, kind of be the test population of how and where you can take this without getting other people upset about it. But the thing is, I think if you continue to come back to the fact that this is behavior analysis. And behavior, I'm at SIU, it's the first behavior analysis program in the world, and the degree program is behavior analysis and therapy. I mean, this was supposed to always be what we did. But for some reason, as the professionalization of this discipline evolved, it became very narrow in terms of we're going to do very basic skill acquisition and behavior suppression for kids with autism. But it wasn't supposed to be just that. So I think that you guys have an ethical responsibility to make sure that our whole field is being used and all the science is being used, and to let it spread as far as you can. And I think that there's too much data. You'll see, you're going to see data over the next 4 days, and thousands of studies. When is enough enough? Who here is running the VB map on kids? Raise your hands. Okay, how much data you got on that? And we're talking thousands of studies here, and that's not enough. So,
How much data do you have on that? Is that
on my stuff?
Yeah, on the VB map, do you know?
There's zero.
I just wanted to,
Okay.
I thought you were thinking that, and I wanted it to be said out loud. One way to think about this, the ethics kind of thing, the scope of practice, there's one having to do just with the professional discipline and the certification and the things. But when you're working with a population, when you're working with a particular problem area, if you're working in a particular agency, part of the ethical responsibility is to bring your whole professional self to that. And there's lots of things that could interfere with being able to do that in a particular way. You haven't been trained enough with that particular population. You may have issues and reactions to that particular population, you know it full well. And you've got to work on that before you're actually able to work flexibly with that. That may not be on the rule book list, except there's rules saying to operate within your ability to actually deliver the goods in a way that serve the people that you're serving, right? So I'll take just an example. Suppose somebody is working in an agency where they also have to deal with abused children. Some of you do that. Are all of us in here saying, I'm ready to do it? Man, I'm ready to work with abused children. Well, some of us in here with all the certification and then say, no, I'm not ready for that. You have an ethical obligation to work with populations under the conditions in which you're ready to do what needs to be done for them as best as we can know it based on the science and practice of our field. So you don't just find those things in a rule book, you find those things in your ability to function in role and to be there for the lives of the people that you serve. In addition to that, you have, guild-related, state-related, certification-related rules and regulations, right? Now, I'm a little cynical about these things, I admit. I've never been fond of some of them. Actually, one reason I didn't immediately grandfather into the BCBAs is I worried where it would go, because I worried also about licensure of psychologists as clinical psychologists and things like that, because sometimes having a license means that you take license. Are we really about protecting people, or are we about protecting our profession and the professionals? Well, it's not by accident that the word guild comes from a root word that means money. Guilders, right? It's the same root. Now, I'm not saying if you have any professional interests or anything that you're only concerned with money. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying let's keep our eye on the people that we serve and be a little slow about some of these other guild restrictions and so forth. Being mindful of we've got to be ourselves prepared to deliver the goods beyond what's in the rule book. But then I look at the rule book and I say, okay, so does the rule book really say that you can't apply principles of behavior to behavior? It doesn't say that. It says the exact opposite. Okay, here's what we never decided as a field. We can decide which procedures have been empirically validated. If somebody's talking about stimulus procedures and the way they're used in a particular, nobody's going to say, oh my God, you're using stimulus control procedures. Why? You'd never think of that, right? It's been worked out how to do that. If you're doing something that has to do with, for example, shaping, and you're shaping to a particular, nobody's going to say, oh my God, you're using shaping. No, because the principles are well established, right? What we never decided as a field, and it's right up here, is what that little word meant of based on behavioral principles. What's that? If it means based on the behavioral principles that were there in 1968, period, end of story, we've created a profession that can't grow with scientific knowledge, which is a betrayal of our tradition. I mean, it's the deepest kind of betrayal. We didn't come here to applaud for dead people. I love these people. I know every one of them. They're never going to write another word. If we honor them, let's honor what they did. And part of what they did was to work out what those behavioral principles were and how to put them in the lives of people. But we have to decide as a field what are the basic principles that deserve to be added, right? Now, the RFT work made a big claim. It said there's a new principle involved here. Is it relational operance? No, that's not a new principle. Relational operance is just a new phenomenon. If somebody says, oh, there's no way to test whether or not there are relational operants, if they're a behavior analyst, bring them close to me, and then I'm going to slap them very hard. Because what you're telling me, operant psychologist, is you can't recognize an operant when you see one, even if you research it. In other words, I will protect the Skinnerian house by burning it down. I will protect it by so claiming ignorance that you can never hold me to account to judging whether or not behavior is an operant. That's not behavior analysis, my friend. That's a political movement, it's a religious movement, it's a monument, living monument to people who are dead. It's not a science. You have to be able to step up to that challenge. Now, here's the problem. If it's not 1968, well, then what year is it? 78? 88? 98? So, I get that we don't go running out and when somebody says there's a new principle, I go, oh my God, there is. By the way, what is the new principle in relational operance? Transformation of stimulus functions. Transformation of stimulus functions is the only operant that operates on behavioral principles and can turn classical conditioning into something we've never seen before, where you can have more arousal to something you've never been shocked to than something you've been shocked to. Not because it looks similar, not because it was paired with, it's not space, it's not time, it's not similarity, it's relational behavior that puts them together. That's weird. That's a really weird operant. It operates on behavioral principles. Yeah, it can turn reinforcers into punishers. It can turn appetives into aversives, aversives into appetives. You just saw an aversive into appetitive. If I did my work properly with Tim, the next time the voice shows up, it's a reminder of what I came to do. It's an appetitive. Come on. Hey, give me a little bit of, judgment. See it? You can actually do that. Now, I'm going on a rant. Let me bring it down.
Rein it in.
Somebody said they were listening earlier and they wanted to say, preach it, Steve, preach it. Good. I'm going, oh my God, am I getting into that voice? Here's the deal. Let's agree as behavior analysts how much data are enough for things to be based on behavioral principles. If it's the case that relational operants, which are just operants, there's nothing spooky about them, but they do a weird thing, you get a transformation of stimulus functions that we haven't seen before, therefore you need new names. When the bell rings, get the cake out of the oven. It rings, is that an SD? Dude, don't say it's an SD. There's no experience of differential reinforcement for the presence or absence of reinforcers in the presence of the bell. It's not that. It's a verbal antecedent. It's rule governed. It has discriminative-like functions. You could say it's a verbal SD, a relational SD, but don't just say it's an SD. You need differential reinforcement for it to be an SD. Don't just say response generalization or stimulus generalization until you say, how did that happen? I mean, show me you can model it in the lab. So I want our scope of practice to be based on these principles, and I want them based on the best evidence of behavioral principles. Now, if you have a way of vetting that and you decide, I'll try to keep this short, and you decide, okay, behavioral principles including RFT, or behavioral principles including RFT, and by the way, multi-leveled and multidimensional evolution science, which is what I'd prefer you say. That's what Skinner said. Go read him. He was an evolutionary psychologist. He died writing the words. It wasn't just contingencies. It's also contingency selection, contingencies of cultural evolution, right? You know that. Well, let's put that in too, right? Then when the principles are there, if there's still a scope of practice issue, that is a guild issue that over time needs to be worked on. But not by being silly and busting down the doors. For example, when you're doing parent training out of this kind of model, you start working with couples. How close are you to couples therapy? You're not that far away, but you can do it as couples training right now. You do parent training, you can do couples training. I suggest you not call it couples therapy. But 10 years from now, 15 years from now, if we work out the principles, are you behavior analysts doing couples therapy? I'd say probably yeah. Why not? Are you going to tell me coaches can do it? MFTs can do it? Social workers can do it? Family, and you can't do it? But that doesn't mean running out with your hair on fire. See what happens when you do that. And say, I'm going to do it now. No, please don't do that. And especially don't do it in the name of ACT. All it would take is somebody getting crazy, and doing psychotherapy under a BCBA and blaming ACT for it. Focus on the principles. Let's work as a field how to vet them and decide them, how to implement these things. And just a couple of tweaks, I want to be able to freshen up what behavioral principles mean, and I want to be able to target private events too, but not to subtract the overt behavior. And then we can work out as a field how we actually put it into responsible forms of practice in an ethical way. Sorry for such a long rant.
Can I throw in a little bit about
Yeah.
scope of practice too? So everything that he said, and another really important thing to consider is anytime you're doing something significantly different from what you've been trained to competence on, it's an issue of scope of competence, and that's actually separate from scope of practice. Parent training is definitely within our scope of practice. Severe SIB, scope of practice, no problem. Skill acquisition, scope of practice, no problem. OBM, all that stuff, right? But if your proper training and supervision and mentorship has only been in one of those specialties, then diving into one of the other ones without any prior training, and it's really different and there's high stakes, that's unethical anyways. So if all you've done is high quality skill acquisition and now you try to go do super severe functional analysis and treatment of SIB, even that would be a scope of competence issue, right? And that's not some weird crazy thing called ACT. And I would say it's the same thing. If you're starting to infuse ACT principles and procedures into your daily practice as a BCBA, if it's way different from what you've been trained to do, well, then you better go get some training and supervision. Here you are getting 4 days, right, all day. But still, you could follow up with a little bit of consultation, mentorship from other folks who are already doing it. So I don't think that, I think the jump from like the parent training you already do to ACT-informed parent training is a lot smaller than the jump from, working with little kids with autism to consulting in the boardroom of a Fortune 500 company. Like, you know what I mean? And yet that's no problem. That's not unethical. Does that make sense?
No.
We should, yeah.
We might need a runner. I don't know if there's any
Or
mic
just
runners
yell.
around.
We can repeat what you said.
Oh yeah, if you do it really loud, we will repeat it. Close here, we can do it. Back there, we'll need runners.
My concern with this particular practice is the ramifications or potential consequences. So we're talking, because you're evoking a lot of emotion for people, you're talking worst case scenario, suicide, homicide, as a reaction to some of the things you're talking about. And I think one needs to have a training. I mean, there's 1,500 hours of practicum that's needed to get your license to practice this therapy. So that's my concern. And so, that's why I'm here as well. But I mean, what we saw today, it's a little bit on the scary side, if you will.
This last one?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a lot of course, what people who, have licensure to practice therapy do, and working with families who kill their children, right? I mean, these are very serious type of scary things that took practicum and mentorship in order to deal with and help. Not to mention compassion fatigue that happens or secondary trauma that happens to therapists and that type of thing. And you have to be aware of that, I guess. So that's all.
Yeah, no,
That's all.
I agree. And I think that, for the standard BCBA to do what we saw here today would be risky. But at one time, it was also risky to enter into a classroom with a kid who was biting his own flesh and engaging in extreme SIB. But now that's okay. And I think that the reason why it is because us as a science and as a community started to define what needed to be done, what the scope should be, and then implemented course requirements and training necessities in order to make sure that as you guys got that credential, that you had the ability to handle some of those kind of cases. So yeah, maybe right now what Steve did here is a little bit outside of the FBAs and BIPs that you guys write. However, why are we not then pushing our credentialing entity and our training programs to include the type of skills necessary, or the techniques necessary to teach us so that we can do these things?
And
What our field is defined as right now doesn't need to be what it is defined as in 5 or 10 years. We make those decisions as a field. Every time the BACB sends out those surveys about what do you need, what are you doing, that dictates what ends up on that task list. So every one of you needs to be talking about this stuff because it's you that will make the definition of the field, not us.
Just a quick little thing before we go on. In terms of compassion fatigue, there's something like 9 randomized trials of ACT for helping professions, and they all basically show a decrease in burnout, increase in sense of personal accomplishment. I don't think we have to be victimized by the hard work that we do. If you can connect with meaning and purpose and connection and so forth inside the very difficulty, just like we were working on here. Some of these things that become oppressive and sources of burnout and so forth instead lift us up. And that's just not a fantasy thing. There are ways of holding things that are hard in a way that don't have the same kind of detrimental effect on our repertoires that we see in burnout and compassion fatigue and so forth. And the other part about it is this kind of fear that if we open the door to emotion, we're going to open the door to suicidal things, etc. And I know you don't mean that in a cartoon version, but actually it's probably the opposite. Part of the suicidal kind of, well, for one thing, you want to predict who coming back from the various wars we send out to, people out to, are going to develop PTSD and are going to have suicidal thoughts. I can predict it with psychological flexibility measures. How are people going to be able to step up to the PTSD, trauma, etc. from coming back? And are they going to show you diminished suicidal thoughts? I can predict that from psychological flexibility processes if you can move them. So the fear is that if I open myself to emotion, then I open myself up to pain, and if I open myself up to pain, well, then I'm going to want a way out. That it is not like that. If we can open ourselves up to, we all are carrying pain, but if we can open ourselves up to it in a way that can transform it into this kind of appetitive reinforcer of meaning and purpose and making a difference and so forth, it can be our ally instead of our burden. And so I'm sobered by the issue of suicidality, but I'm not frightened by the issue of suicide, because that is built into the human condition. That's why I quoted those statistics to you. And most of the things they tell you to do, including in your MFT training, by the way, the actual evidence on it are not helpful with suicidality. All those contracts and all those plans are almost inert. They're just professions protecting their freaking ass. That's what they are. They're CYA regulations. They're not helping people regulations. Because it can happen. because it can't happen, and you might get sued. Okay, so
And
buy a
we-
lot of insurance. But meanwhile, can we worry about the human lives that we're working with? Can we be concerned about? And we have ACT protocols for dealing with suicidality and so forth. Now, I don't see this as actually outside the scope of practice of a BCBA. If you're doing an adolescent group or something, you could do that right now. How many people are doing skills training groups? You could do that right now, couldn't you? Yeah, I know you wouldn't quite dig in that hard and stuff, but you can do it in a way that fits the people that you're serving. And at the point at which you can, and you can link it back to principles that matter, that seems to me within our scope of practice as far as competence, get the training.
And and the point I wanted to make too was, I think you can dial it in and dial it back how emotionally evocative you're being, and you don't need to make everyone totally cry every time necessarily when you're doing this stuff. And there is a degree there. I mean, there's people like a Kelly Wilson that's just making people sob constantly all the time. And it works, clearly, obviously. And yet, I mean, I don't know, even before I learned ACT, every single time I had an effective parent training session, I made the parent cry a little bit. Didn't do it on purpose. It's just, and looking back, I realized it's because I was talking about values, and that's what happens. When you talk about what you really care about for your kids, you're going to tear up, especially when you realize, okay, now I need to do something about it, So a little bit of emotional evocation, I think, is fine. And then you need to be smart about dialing in and dialing it back, just like we are with anything else that we do. If you're doing escape extinction and there's a huge, extinction burst, or if you're doing a manual restraint, or anything else that we do, we have to be smart. We have to be careful about it.
We got
And I
3
think
people in, and so they're recognized. You want to go, John? But I'll get back to you.
So
And-
one of the things to the concern brought, I think it's important as BCBAs, we don't leave this room and say, I'm going to open hang a shingle and do something different. We're going to go out and bring this to what we're doing. And so I think the concern of, are you going to engender suicidality? If you're already playing with that space in your BCBA practice, I'm curious what tools you'd be using that are effective. And if you're not in that space, then don't go into that space till you've got the competence. So I think when I hear about, can we do ACT, you can infuse ACT in what you're doing now. And if you're doing something now that's outside your competence, stop that and back up. But I think that's, when I hear the concern is don't worry too much about, I'm doing ACT with the parents that are crying because I just told them about the value of their kids' growth. Think about how can I help them lean into that and move forward. So I think that's kind of an important, versus don't go and say, I did a boot camp and now I'm going to help you with your problem of your marriage and we're going to walk through this Hexaflex. I think that would be a bad idea. But
Yeah, and also don't say, well, the 3 of us said you guys could do everything.
that's for sure.
We're not going to record this and deny it all.
No,
But I
we
think
got
that-
it recorded right there. We're
Dang
taking
it.
a picture.
But I do think we're at the beginning of defining these boundaries, not at the end. And so if you're expecting the list from us, we don't have it. I think that you guys have to go out there and push the boundaries of what you were doing, and in safe, responsible, and ethically appropriate ways. And then also push the BACB for inclusion of these things if they're meaningful and they work with clients that you serve.
I'll take these 2, and then we'll come to everybody else. But
So the hospital that I work at
hang on a second, if you can just, because better if we all hear you.
Hello. Okay.
Hello.
The hospital that I work at currently, I've been incorporating more and more of these skills into my therapy with the families, with the parent trainings I'm doing, with even to a certain extent of, like food refusal with kids or self-injurious behavior, trying to show the parents what is actually important with these kids, and then the kids who are verbally competent enough to do so, trying to bring that in as well. Whenever I'm the only behavior analyst at my hospital right now, and then whenever anybody else sees that, especially the psychologists, they say, you don't have the training for this, you don't have the clinical knowledge, and you don't know the DSM, so you shouldn't be doing these things. You should just stick with skill acquisition. So the thing that I usually say, I'll show them the articles, and I say, I am sticking with skill acquisition. Here's my data. Here's the results. You can interview them and see how it goes. And it just always comes back to that point. So I don't know if you have any suggestions on how to help convince them or buy in, or maybe I should just ditch the place and then.
One thing, if you can stay away from the DSM, do. If you can't, I know some settings you can't, but if you can stay away from it, I suggest things like overt behavior.
Yeah.
That would be good. I think you can include private events. You don't need 5 out of 9s and 4 out of 7s. It doesn't organize the world into treatment responsive units. You understand that, right? The correlation between that categorical exercise and predicting what the treatment is almost zero. And oh, by the way, the reliability of the DSM-5 on some of the major categories is 0.25. You can't publish anything in JAVA with that. So the ones who are chest thumping about the DSM, send them a few studies on how lousy that dog is in its ability to predict treatment response and to be applied reliably. And can we as a community just stay as far away from that thing as we can?
But realistically, you're not going to win that argument, right? I'm assuming they're higher up in the hospital or whatever. But if you do just focus on there's skills that we're training, overt behaviors that I'm getting these parents to do, state goals, state things they care about, state values. Reword it to be behavior, just overt behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I would talk
and
about
we
it
need
as goal
results
setting.
in overt behavior, right? And if you're
Yeah.
not seeing those, then who cares anyways?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just call it goal setting.
There was one more over here. No, it
Hi.
was back there. Yeah, there we go. And then it was back open again, but I was just trying to be
I think a
orderly.
lot of our research and behavior analysis has traditionally been done with individuals with disabilities. And as soon as we move into the community, we're dealing with, a household is like a behavioral system. And there's all of these people who's, if we want them to, implement a procedure or something like that, we can probably speak to them in ways that evoke that behavior when we learn about the context that they're coming from, so that we're not making suggestions that are unreasonable. I think sometimes, and I think it's also a little bit, I don't know. Yeah, I get that sometimes it becomes, parents will start complaining about each other, but I think that understanding where people are coming from is so important, and it's our mediators are ultimately that's whose behavior we're changing, and the side effect is the kid's behavior. So I think it fits, like, perfectly.
Comments?
Can I
Yep.
pipe in here? I just wanted to ask this gentleman who was just talking about the hospital, when you were using these procedures, were you referring to it as using ACT when you were talking to the other staff at your hospital?
Yeah, so when they
I still want to keep talking.
Alrighty. So when they would say, like, where did you get this? They said, like, oh, that kind of looks like what we do. Where did you get these methods? I would say, oh, it comes from relational frame theory. It comes from acceptance and commitment therapy.
So I would just look to you, Steve, and Mark and Jonathan, and ask, what would be your guidelines and suggestions? Because earlier you kind of basically said, don't go out there in the name of ACT. So I just want to be clear, like, you don't want people to leave this room and start saying, guess what? I went to this amazing boot camp, and it's so awesome. And now I want to implement ACT, and we're going to do that. Okay, everybody, let's get on board. Do you want that? Do you not want that? How do you suggest that we leave this room and talk about this?
I don't know if we all agree.
Yeah,
I don't think that I do ACT. I mean, I don't do ACT. I understand human behavior through ACT. I mean, ACT is what taught me about complex human behavior. And so everything that comes out of the mom's mouth, everything that comes out of the therapist's mouth is a key or a clue into their rule-governed behavior and private events and fusion and all of that. So am I saying I do ACT? No. Like Evelyn Gould, my PhD student who published her DIS, we called it an ACT-based parent training approach or whatever, but that's just because that's the term used in the literature. I mean, it was still just parent training informed by this stuff. And a lot of times we like to do components, right? It's not even like we're doing the whole thing. We're taking a piece from here. Like we'll put in values in our first day of new therapist training. We're not doing ACT. but like, did it come from ACT? Yeah, for sure. There's specific exercise. So,
Well, I'm not talking to couples or parents usually. I'm trying to get a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old with autism to care about getting his work done. And so that whole value side of the Hexaflex becomes, recess. It becomes the Legos. It becomes, observable, delayed reinforcers. And so I think that, again, it depends on how far you push this out or bring it in. And I guess in my work, it's been trying to bring this back to observable, measurable, accountable things, not necessarily because I think that's only where it can go, but that's where I guess I feel comfy with, as well as where I think the utility is for the kids that we're working with. And as I'm teaching those frontline teachers and staff, the utility here, like just get this kid to remember about what's going to happen later by getting him in the present right now. So it's a little bit, I think it's ACT, but I think it's just a different way. It's not getting parents to talk about the feelings. And so again, that's, my scope or my clinical expertise is working with that segment of the population, and that's how I'm rolling it out. But I personally would still not go to those parents and start digging into their personal lives with ACT or with anything else, just because that's not what I do.
Just going back to this, acceptance and commitment training, acceptance and commitment therapy, are just efforts to apply the psychological flexibility model. The psychological flexibility model is a particular take on how relational framing interacts with more ancient learning and social learning and even basic biological processes play out. We've got these multiple evolutionary streams. And the direct contingency principles and relational framing kinds of principles are kind of co-evolving, and there's a name for how those interact, and we can learn how to help them play nice, and that's called the psychological flexibility model. It's not a fixed model. It may change over time. There's going to be a psychological flexibility 2.0. I don't know what's in it, but I know it's there. I know a few elements. I can make some guesses as where it's coming. As long as you're doing things driven by behavioral principles and psychological flexibility model and what you know about relational framing, if you want to call it ACT for what you're doing, you certainly have my blessing. Call it ACT. I suggest the word training if you're a BCBA rather than therapy. It's a little safer and doesn't hurt anything. Just call it training. If you don't want to call it ACT, we don't care. We don't care. Steal this stuff. If I could write a book on ACT and call it Steal This Book, I would, but Abby Hoffman already stole it back in the hippy-dippy days. Because the whole purpose of it is to put principles into practice that change people's lives. That's the only game that matters. And there's a utility to branding, and you actually explored it. You get a little bit of protection by those studies. You're doing this acceptance and commitment training, and here's this study on acceptance and commitment training. That gives you a little bit of protection. But it's not act uber alles. This is not an attempt to create a schoolhouse and get the tattoo. This is just branding. So if you're in a setting where you can do more to serve others by taking these principles and rebranding them, and it's not just some ego trip of, I want it named after me, but it's some real thing about, please do that. Please do it. We have a president of ACBS who does mindfulness-based emotional intelligence training. What is that? It's otherwise known as ACT. But when he goes to business and industry, he doesn't want to use the T word, the therapy word, and even acceptance sounds a little weird, a little too very, very loosey-goosey, Mindfulness, emotional intelligence. Ooh, they saw it in the Harvard Business Review. Ooh, so he's entering into these corporations with mindfulness-based emotional intelligence training. I'm applauding. I don't care. So slice, dice, rename, but be thoughtful about. There's a cool thing that's when we can say, there's X number of thousand studies of relational framing and ACT. It gives us kind of a protection and a space within which we can explore these things and work out over time, carefully, how best to put it into practice. Psychological flexibility, that's not an option. It's just like reinforcement. Relational framing, not an option. You can say, relational framing, joint control, VB map, it doesn't matter. I mean, relational framing is what it does, and it's just kind of a thing that is helpful to analytic work scientifically. So it's more like what you're saying, I think.
We could call it verbal behavior training because it's basically all verbal behavior.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's rebrand it.
It's just a lot more complex. I mean, it really is.
Well, somebody, Ruth Ann was talking about that nice piece.
Yeah.
You know, that little piece, if you read it, you know, the Barnes Holmes, Cullinan, et cetera, that moved Ruth Ann. But basically what it says is, well, there's nonverbal tax and there's verbal tax. There's nonverbal mans, there's verbal mans. It's kind of cool, right? It's subversive. I mean, I'm surprised the Skinnerians just didn't freaking out. Because guess what all the verbal ones were? Relational framing. You know, we got all the good stuff. But, you know, but if that helps us serve people, let's call it that. Let's call it Fred the Wonder Slug. I don't care.
Yeah. I mean, the ACT studies are in JAM. They are in
Yeah,
Java.
they're there.
They're in Java. So what, you know, what do we need? You know, what's the proof? And as Steve said, I think people are protecting turf, they're protecting careers, but the data are the data. And we're supposed to be behavior analysts that go where the data are. I mean, how much data do we need?
Yeah, and that's a good question. We shouldn't just say how much data do we need to dismiss it. No, you're not meaning to dismiss it. We've lived inside this how much data you need question by giving more and more and more and more data. Now, sooner or later, you start asking it with an attitude. I'm pretty close
I
to
already
it.
got an attitude.
Yeah, I got a little bit. I got a few more years on you, and I've got that multiplied. You know, I have a shrill voice that shows up at ABBA. You know, like, come on. But that's just, set that aside. It is a good question. How much data is enough? That's a good question. I don't have really, I saw
You
you,
got a mic?
and then I saw you. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm just gonna
I
go.
saw you.
So I guess I struggle too. I think it's really important what Jonathan said about scope of competence. None of us have the same experience. I come from originally from a state in Pennsylvania where it doesn't matter what mental health license you have. You can be a social worker, a counselor, a family therapist, and you can work with a severe child who's almost killing themselves or their parents, a child with autism. It doesn't matter, you just have to have any license and you are qualified. So I think that it is about protecting, and people are more concerned about their professional. Behavior analysts, we look at our data, we analyze it. So if you're doing an ACT principle and it's not working, you should be analyzing that. And that's, I think that's what makes it even more of a fit for us, where, other therapists, they don't necessarily have to do that.
Well, and I think it's important to look at population-specific stuff, even though the diagnosis doesn't predict necessarily, it doesn't tell you what to do functionally. There are characteristics of populations that you probably should know about if you're going to work with that population. So I wouldn't start doing suicide prevention tomorrow because I actually don't know. There's probably stuff about suicide I need to know. I don't know any of it, right? So I would need to go get some mentorship, read some articles. I wouldn't start doing eating disorders tomorrow, although I'm really interested in that for the same reason. Probably get some supervision and mentorship. But not because getting a licensed psychology certificate now suddenly lets you know the monster inside the mind that will help you protect the person or something. It's not like that. But there probably is practical, useful, real information before you go doing something really different.
Could I just say something that was occasioned by that, which is this? There are populations for whom nobody with science interests really care that much about it, except behavior analysts. And it's important to people that behavior analysts serve those folks. I'll give you an example. I mean, well, not quite that extreme, but just a touch on it. In this country, because of how we fund mental health care, behavioral health care, et cetera, there's a direct relationship between the age of the people who receive services and how much money is paid. $250 an hour for an 8-year-old? No, I think I'll just hire somebody else. You living in Beverly Hills, you want a little psychotherapy? That's a cheap price. $500 an hour might be better. yeah? Well, so then praxis faces it. We were just talking about it at lunch. How are we going to bring some of these ACT things into the lives of children? There's not that many clinical psychologists working with children. There's only a few, and the number of child programs is a fraction, right? Why? There's not that much money. Not just children, chronically mentally ill. Not just that, people with developmental disabilities. Not just that, you go through the list, right? That's why we have access to the populations, because we're the folks who are willing. I mean, I remember, I'm a clinical psychologist, et cetera, but, I worked with developmental disabilities. My mentor did work in developmental disabilities. I had a practice doing work with developmental disabilities. It's not like I don't know anything about that kind of realm and stuff. Why are we the ones? Well, I remember going to Colin Anderson, not too far from Morgantown, West Virginia, where people with developmental disabilities were put in concrete rooms that smelled of urine. And they were lucky to get a couple of adults to do anything over a day. It was almost lock, feed, and count. It was more like a zoo, except you didn't go there for fun and stuff, but it was some kind of holding tank. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you remember those places? We were in there humanizing those places and saying, no, we're not going to accept, just saying, they're retards. Please don't bust me with BCBAs for saying that. You know what I'm saying. That's what people said. Is that objectifying, dehumanizing, you think? And because we did that, we humanized some of those places. Because we did that, some of those places were shut down or were put into a form. I mean, people were put into, care facilities that were outside of these kinds of warehousing thing that we used to face when I was a student. And so, rant over, but back to the issue. What I'm saying is there are people who need us, and we are there because we've been there. That's why it's in our scope of practice. Because we cared enough to go to people who needed us, and we did something that transformed human lives, yeah? So can we figure out a way to take what only we can do and bringing even some of those folks in, and in so doing, we do something else. As we work with schools, as you do what you've done, you give mainstream schools a chance to do something transformational for children because you're there. But you're there because of your behavior analytic background, right? So scope of practice, I think if we're going to reach children, we're going to reach families, we're going to, reach the chronically mentally ill, we're going to reach people with developmental disabilities, behavior analysts have to do it. Because we're one of the few folks who care and who are there. And, it's not going to be some hoity-toity psychotherapist, excuse me. Do you see what I'm saying? So part of our burden, challenge, opportunity is to take what we know and to bring our populations with us as we humanize care and care facilities, and from there bring these principles and processes into those lives, but not just that, into other people who touch that in the hospital or in the school or in the clinic or in the community.
Yeah, our scope shouldn't be defined by the populations that we currently work with. It should be defined by what our principles can work for. And I think that when you use a behavioral science that's a technology based on pure contingency-driven learning, of course it's going to work with people with developmental disabilities and minimal verbal repertoires. So great, but that's not where we were supposed to stop. And if we have additional principles and techniques and technologies that allow us to bring in additional populations or levels of populations because of their verbal sophistication, then that means we should be expanding what our scope of services can be. And so just because we've been all comfortable doing severe challenging behavior with nonverbal folks doesn't mean that's all behavior analysis should be about. And the more you learn about the things we're talking about, I think that it opens up a wide range of populations and applications that we can impact.
Hi, I appreciate your caution about who receives this and the training of the people who are offering it. Tiered models are being used by behavior analysts pretty widely. Just wanted to get your thoughts about the application of these these concepts through a tiered model where a behavioral technician might be delivering services, assuming there are no immediate safety issues in question. Guidelines, ethics, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I have this dream that 10 or 20 years from now, we won't even be able to talk about ACT separately from behavior analysis because we'll all, as a field, understand verbal behavior and relational framing and rule-governed behavior to the extent that we're just putting that into everything we do. We're not there yet, obviously, not even close. But I would say, like, ideally, maybe each of you goes back to your organization, and you're the ACT expert for your organization. And you have a mission, should you choose to accept it, of making a difference and imparting some of that knowledge into your organization. Maybe you assign 1 or 2 people to be your sort of assistants in that mission. And you pick a few small projects that are easy enough to bite off, like new therapist training. We're going to start with addressing burnout. Okay, we'll put in some values in the new therapist training and some diffusion. Start with that. If that seems to work, then you pick another. Does that make sense? And I would say just bite off a few projects at a time.
One thing I just want to say about the tiered thing also is that there's supports for doing things at different levels. You mentioned technicians, but there's also online, web-based, book-based, tape-based, etc. It isn't just like, could it possibly be too restrictive a practice that we can suggest books to people? I hope the answer is no. Couldn't possibly be, right? We have randomized trials of ACT books showing about 60% of the outcomes you get by a course of ACT therapy. We have websites, we have apps, we have, and some of these things are very low cost or no cost. This is not a commercial. Yeah, I publish books, etc. COI warning, they're back there. But, no. So I think we'll have a lot of ways forward. And one of the things that the ACT community has done is we've never bought into this guild restrictions and stuff. The CBS universe will take coaches, will take teachers, will take nurses, OTs, PTs, will take any freaking buddy. Here's our distinction. Are you allowed by the laws of your country, and they vary across the world, half of the folks in ACBS are outside of North America, are you allowed to do the work that you're seeking training in or knowledge in by joining? If the answer is yes, come on down. So let's just take principles and set them loose for people and then build the kind of tiers that make sense so that you can have, I was doing psychotherapy kind of work, and I would do kind of ACT-based exposure with undergraduates as my technicians for exposure sessions. Because I couldn't afford to spend the money. Well, I could, but they couldn't. The money it would take to buy me to go out and look at their laundry lint and stuff like that. If they're OCD or whatever, I'd do exposure therapy with technicians. We can build this responsibly, and we can also use the supports that are already there. Some of the folks here, there's things that are already there. They're well-defined protocols, things that are some of them don't even require huge amounts of your online moment-to-moment discrimination ability.
In the world that I'm in schools, if we have a kid that is, I'm training teachers, I'm training teaching assistants on these principles. If we then bump into a kid with severe psychiatric conditions, I'm not living in a vacuum. There's resources within that school, and we should make sure that those other people, the social worker, the school psych, are involved with that case, and that we all are contributing within our scope of what we are experts in. So if I've got a kid with severe, abuse and neglect issues, and we're running them in an ACT classroom and we're telling him to work for his Legos, I'm not going to be trying to dig in on his abuse and neglect as much as I'm going to be saying to those other care providers, can you work on this so I can get this kid to understand more about delayed consequences? And so we're playing together. Now, I know that in behavior analysis we think we're the smartest people in the world. Everybody else is an idiot. But, but the truth is, there's a lot of smart people out there. And we all talk different languages, but I think when you can find people with those different languages that are working towards the same end of, helping the population that you're working with, well, maybe it's okay to talk to them. And maybe it's okay to try to work together with them. And honestly, I feel like this these mid-level terms allow you much more depth in those conversations than if you're saying, well, I'm going to arrange a program, schedule, and reinforcement, and we got a token economy and all the stuff that doesn't make sense once people start talking.
Yeah, I want to connect that just in one other way. Part of what's cool about the CBS Act RFT things is what we're trying to do is create a new form of the original behavior analytic vision. I've dedicated my life basically to undoing what I think were Skinner's two big mistakes. One was he didn't know how to figure out how to get us inside evolution science. He tried, but slipped, and frankly, because he wasn't as good as he needed to be in making friends. That's I knew Fred, and he wasn't as good as he needed to be in making friends. You want to see something sad, go read the book of him going to Ed Wilson, one of the major sociobiologists, evolutionary biologists in the world, sitting down. The first opening line is, why aren't we part of it? Sounds kind of, I want to be part of the group, right? Because what he's saying is, I'm an evolutionist. Why aren't you thinking about us, the behavior analysts? That's his first line. You can get the transcript. There's a book there. Go read it. Of Fred talking to Ed at Harvard, both two. But then, 2 paragraphs later, every freaking thing is an operant. So he's talking about ant behavior, that's an operant. Everything. In other words, why can't we be friends? Oh, by the way, everything you care about is mine. You don't make friends that way. So I'm sorry if I sound like I'm critical of this, my intellectual hero, my single biggest intellectual hero in my life. But in fact, that happened. Well, let's go back and renegotiate that. Figure out a way to play nice with the evolutionists. Actually, the other one is language and cognition. Did he get over the mountain? I don't think he did. I think Peak and some of the other ones that are coming pretty much show that. I believe that. But okay, so now that we've kind of renegotiated that, here's the thing I want to say to you. You've got friends in so many high places. Because if you connect to the ACT RFT work, you're connecting to a much broader kind of thing, which is the contextual behavioral science vision, which is just behavior analysis. It's just another face of Skinnerian behavior analysis. Now, it's true, it isn't necessarily what you would see at ABAI, qua ABAI, over the last 10 years. Back up 20 to 25 years ago, you actually would see it. But we decided, we couldn't wait. And ACBS was created. That's 8,000 people. ACT was created. That's 140, 150 books. You just start thinking about how many people know what you're interested in if you start talking about ACT and RFT. I bet you there's MFTs at your place. You have an MFT background? I bet you, right? There's some of them who know what ACT is. They may not know behavior analysis if it bit them on the freaking ass. So we have an opportunity as behavior analysis steps forward into this, not out of arrogance, but out of this humble connection with other professionals who know what they're doing. And let's use our way of talking and thinking and exploring with others in such a way that invites them in. Don't build fences. Don't use your technical talk when you don't need it. It's fine to talk about values. You can talk about emotions. Words are not mentalistic. Functions are mentalistic, right? And you can non-mentalistically talk about a lot of things your colleagues are interested in a way that brings you in connection to them. Maybe even all the way down to the fact that they know something about ACT. That'd be kind of cool. Maybe we can work together how to put this in our agency. You do that, I'll do this.
Can I ask a
Oh, yeah,
question
good.
since I...
Good. Yeah, you got the...
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I probably am speaking for everybody here too. I hope I am. That it's been really interesting, and I'm already enjoying every part of today. But I feel like one of the things that I'd like to put out at the table is that I know that BACB is really working at disseminating of information about applied behavioral analysis. That's their focus. And what I hear you guys saying, I feel like this is what we're saying, and I've heard you guys use the word at least 3 times about mentor or having a mentor. Jonathan said it twice, and Dr. Hayes has said it once, but you've all said it in different ways. I wonder if there's a way before we leave Tuesday to figure out a way that we can have that mentorship when we get out of here, because I think the difficulty is that we feel like we are loving what we're hearing, but we're not feeling confident completely about going out there and saying, this is what we do. And, you know, I think it makes it easier because every one of you guys up there, maybe some of you down here have a PhD, but we're a BCBA, and sometimes, like the man that was talking over there, or the person that was over there talking about the hospitalization piece, that sometimes if somebody has an MD behind their name or a PhD behind their name, then we, you know, and we don't feel quite as confident as we can. But if we had a mentor, or we had a support group, or we had somebody, or people that we could go to and say, hey, this is what's going on for us, what can we do, what do you think we should, how do you think we should approach that? So anyways, that's what I want to throw out there, is to say, can we somehow maybe have some kind of a round table or some kind of conversation about how we get that done before we leave on Tuesday?
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one way you could get it done, or we could start getting it done, is why don't we, as a group, or some of you guys, form a special interest group in ABAI. There's one for everything else, right? No.
That's stupid. That's a great idea.
There's a, no.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Unless I forgot about it. We just need 10 people. So do we got 10 here that can create this thing? And we put the petition to ABA Council. And then, again, that's not going to solve everything, but, you know, that puts a visible culture on the map of the organization.
And there is an Act for Behavior Analysis Facebook group already,
Yep.
so definitely check that out. And there are multiple people, even in this audience, who are solid behavior analysts, know the ACT work, and actually do mentorship on a consultative basis. So we got to
And
connect folks.
there's a behavior
What's that?
how to get
So
access.
ACBS has a list of like ACT or peer-reviewed ACT trainers, and there's 1 million people who are ACT folks. Most of those aren't behavior analysts; they're mostly clinical psychologists and others. There isn't currently a list of behavior analysts who are ACT trained, I believe.
Well, that'd be
right?
great for
But
that
there is-
special interest
There we go,
group.
special interest.
There is a
group.
special interest group on behavior analysis forming or formed within ACBS. But the other thing I would say to you, just in terms of concretely, how do you move forward? If you do go through the process of linking to ACBS, put in something like peer supervision group. Just put it into the website once you've logged in. And you'll find a whole series of guidelines as to how to create peer supervision groups. Why would you want to do that? Because it turns out that other people can see these kind of processes. Well, I lost my hexagon, but can see these kind of processes that you can't see when you're bound up. And you don't have to be an expert. You know, and if I can use an example, Carmen Luciano, who's a behavior analyst, who is a student of Skinner's, one of Skinner's last students, and is a major kind of ACT RFT person in Spain, was doing work on ACT as a behavior analyst in Spain without consultation with me, setting these things up. When I met with her, I went, wow, that's really cool. She was doing an awesome job out of books and tapes and peers. Because like when you're hooked, when you're fused, if you have some friendly, even if they're not experts, Carmen didn't become an expert in ACT by working with experts. She did it by creating a group, applying behavioral principles as a student of Skinner and as a behavior analyst, and then working out, doing the research. So there is a way forward towards competence. It isn't just, although we should use the supervisors and the people that know, don't forget that there's people next to you who might be of use to you. And some of those aren't necessarily people who are the God's experts, but they're interested, they're reading, they will talk to you, they have time. They'll look and read and see your sessions or whatever you're doing. They'll look at your protocols, they'll look at your plans, they'll give you feedback. And if you're willing to do the same to them, we be rocking.
And it's worth noting this is just the first day. Like, you're going to feel way more confident and competent by the end of the fourth day.
You betcha.
You leave somewhere and then you know,
Yeah.
this is kind of seductive in a way, and so then you leave and then you have a problem and you're like,
Yeah.
okay, now what do I do? And I want to talk to somebody about it because
Yep.
it's only my brain, and so it's nice to have somebody else's brain there with that might have a better.
That's just the kind of monkey we are. What you're saying is, you get out of here. If you're not talking to people, you're not working with it, you're not doing it, and you're not connecting with others, no, it's not going to stay. The kind of monkey we are requires other monkeys to do it. I got a bunch of monkeys here. These are kind of act monkeys. They'll help you. You had one right here. I know you had one back there, but he was just begging from me. But you're going to say it loud, and then I'll get back to you. No, you can keep the mic. I'll repeat it.
While they have no trouble recognizing our expertise with autism and intellectual disabilities, I could become the most proficient ACT person, but if I was wanting to then address drug addiction, anxiety, depression, they would say, well, unless you're a clinical psychologist or have a counseling degree, that's not your field of expertise. How to overcome that barrier, so that we know those fields are open to us and we're not just pigeonholed into autism or intellectual disabilities.
You guys could speak to that better than me.
I guess my answer would be get that additional credential and start pushing that discipline a little
Kind
bit.
of almost have to, yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I
get
mean,
up
I
to
think
bill, right?
Right. I think when it comes to money, we can say anything we want up here, but there are laws regarding who can do what, and you either lobby those push against those laws, or suck it up and get that additional credential.
Let me add one more thing. I
Yeah.
did see that I believe it was Virginia, they were looking at passing a bill that would have them acknowledging BCBAs as mental health providers, and I don't know if it'll be something that easy.
This is something that's going to be lobbied for over time as we gain more expertise. They take the drug and alcohol field, for example. Could we enter into that field in such a way that with appropriate training and so forth, there's no doubt that BCBAs can do that? Of course, we've been doing it forever, and for goodness sakes. Okay. I think about these guys. What were they doing? They're doing things like Juniper Gardens and, the program for juvenile delinquents and, family. Todd Risley was the head of mental health in Alaska. I mean, how did it happen? The BCAs are only, how did that happen? Well, we don't just sort of tantrum and walk it back. We have to expand it out and do what was being done when we started, which is, behavioral principles taken to where. So I would suggest a few things, like, for example, I wouldn't immediately go to like working with depression, but I would work with the overt behavioral pieces of that are there in the populations you're working with and in the parents and others who are working with them. And oh, by the way, don't forget the professionals. And you've got staff training work to do. You've got parent training work to do. You've got, high functioning folks who are, what Ann was saying. Yeah? Is somebody going to come in and say, oh, you can't work on being more involved in socially reinforcing activities as a behavior analyst with a population that you're working with because you're doing it by talking about values? That's not going to happen. You can do that. So could we build the expertise in terms of where the field is going, whether it's drug and alcohol, start with the populations for whom, frankly, other people don't want to necessarily work with these populations anyway. But the same problems are there. And let's build out our expertise and then think about, well, what does that have to do? Could I be a certified drug and alcohol counselor? Well, I think yes, with additional training. Over time, yes, when it's in the scope of competence of BCBAs, as we carve that out. And, drug and alcohol kind of stuff, for goodness sakes, behavior analysts have been involved in that from jump. Joe Brady, and go back, some of the really important early foundational work. on drug and alcohol work was behavior analytic work. But we're everywhere. You know, I mean, I tantrum when I think about it. Can I do a short little tantrum? I'll give you the weirdest one that you'd think of, Gestalt therapy. Oh, Gestalt therapy is so far from behavior analysis. What are you talking about? Pearls, Hefferline, and Goodman. Who is Ralph Hefferline? He's an animal freaking operant guy. He's Fred Keller's colleague at Columbia. He wanted to call it integrative therapy because it combined behavioral principles and humanistic principles. And it was Fritz who called it Gestalt therapy because he thought Wertheimer was coming back, which was a joke, and it never happened. Now, the tantrum part of it is, okay, we've now let that go. If you're going to do a Gestalt therapy, you probably don't want to do it under a BCBA, but we kind of work at the sleep at the wheel. Those exercises in that first Gestalt book that you think are really cool, the hippie dippies did, I loved it as a hippie. There are all these kind of things on contact with the present moment, flexible attention. That's Ralph's work. It's not Fritz's work. A behavior analyst wrote it, and we gave it away. So no more giving away our principles in our field. That doesn't mean that tomorrow we can just turn what's happened over the last 40 or 50 years, but let's not be so stupid as we did in the past, and hang on to our principles and gradually build this thing out where a scope of competence includes the places where we can take the principles. And let's see how far it goes. I don't think that is it written somewhere that BCBAs can never do couples therapy? Now, I wouldn't do it. Like 10 years from now, maybe we're there. Can't do drug and alcohol work? Now, I'd be cautious. 10 years from now, I don't know. Let's see. What can we together create that's based on this filter? Tantrum over.
I know that some states have their chapters of the BACP, and so there are usually great public policy committees from your state chapter, and I'm from Arizona, and so we've done that, and we now have BCBAs on the APA board, and we have licensure in that state, so they're it's a commingling that took many years, but
You want to repeat it or somebody? Because not everybody back there, you can't hear it. No way, we'll repeat it.
Local ABAI chapter, affiliated chapter associations, most of them do have public policy committees. So yeah, get out there, put your name out there, get involved. And certainly with states that have licensure for behavior analysts, getting behavior analysts on the psych boards or the social sciences board, whatever board governs the licensure for behavior analysts is a great idea, for sure.
So what kind of hasn't been addressed yet is how we go about taking data on things like contacting the present moment or selfless context. Like, we guide people through these exercises, but we don't really have so much of like a verbal report afterwards of whether or not they're engaging in those behaviors.
I'll show you tomorrow.
Awesome. What a great answer. They're there. They're there. I got it.
Can I ask?
But it's a good question. You have to step up to that challenge. If you can't, something's wrong. Right? We'll
Can I
step
say
up.
something real quick?
Yeah, Tim.
I'm from Maine, and like the closest McDonald's is 25 miles away. So how, or what suggestions would you give to a very rural BCBA who often finds, I find myself wanting to work with a kid, but then I realize that the mother and then the grandmother and then all this stuff, I can't get to the kid until I try to deal with everybody else.
Well, in the modern era, you can get supervision by world-class people. You can. Some of that might cost money, but if you don't want to do that, you can get peer connections with really expert people through, Zoom and Skype and all the rest. You can reach out, create virtual communities. You can have virtual peer support groups.
Would you like to come to Maine?
In the summer.
It's a formal invitation.
There.
And I bet you there's some active behavior analysis folks in Maine. I know there is. In fact, I've trained some of them. Are you walking it over, Tim? We're going to let the operational definition of attention be Tim's mic. You're going to have to deal with him.
This meeting.
Yeah.
One of the recommendations I've got for the fellow asked about funding is humbly partner up with those who have access to that. So if you want to get in the place like drug addiction, join some groups in that area and say, hey, this is really cool. Can you show me what you're doing? And as you're doing that, you can often lean into, hey, you know, I've got something that might be interesting, and join in like clinics that do that. So it allows access there. They start to see our value and they'll bring it on board. That's a much stronger approach than the I need licensure to do this, or you should pay this novel thing. And I've seen that work a lot better in getting that. And then also, these underserved populations, there's grants out there. If you get into some grant funding, service grants, those often will allow for payments that an insurance company wouldn't. So those are things I would look at. Read your state licensure very carefully to make sure you're not crossing into other practice acts. But that's an area I've seen a lot of I get grants that come through, I kind of look through, and there's all sorts of interesting things. How do we, I'm a city that wants to solve the kids that are suffering from this, and we'll pay this much. And if you can convince them that you've got a technology, they'll often open up the doors. So those are areas.
By the way, somebody passed this thing. Why don't we create a kind of an optional sign-up sheet for name, email, and stuff, and then a few questions. Are they interested in peer supervision, et cetera? In other words, create a little process that we could share, and that seems like a really good idea, and we'll pass this thing around. We'll figure out a way to crafting it. And by the way, I always say this, and I hope it's okay, but at the end of boot camp, typically I ask the organizers if they'll share with me their emails, and I send out a little thing saying, would you be part of my list? I don't sell anything. I'm just connecting and helping get resources, etc. That may be true of some others here as well. And so maybe we can add that. You know, do you mind being in? We don't want to spam you. I won't spam you. But there's a community. You know, and if you don't put this work into community, it just doesn't work because we're not that kind of monkey. We got to learn this socially.
So have we given you some ideas about scope of practice and the ethics around it? I don't know if we've given you the answers, but I think we've given you some guidelines in terms of how to navigate through these not black and white issues, but these shades of gray, and do so carefully and competently. And where you're dissatisfied with where your scope is, start making the change happen. Don't just let other people dictate our science. You guys are participants in that science.
If you feel as though you're going beyond a barrier, step back, consult. You can even reach us. You can reach your peers, look at it again, and then as a community, we take knowledge where it needs to go to be served. This is our last question or comment because the clock is telling me.
This is loud. I was just going to volunteer. We can do that pretty easily through a Google form and then have a link and everybody can go in and just answer the questions and then it builds a spreadsheet. So, simple thing.
Have we done our work this evening? Are we at the point? Yeah, I think we are. Thanks for the panel.